What would you do if the only thing standing between you and freezing to death was a door you weren't sure you had the right to open? The night Miriam Cole turned 53, she didn't have a cake. She didn't have candles, or a card, or anyone to call. What she had was a garbage bag with 2 changes of clothes, a purse with $41 and some change, and a car that had stopped running somewhere outside of Cochrane, Alberta, in the middle of a November storm that the radio had been warning about for 3 days, back when she still had a radio to listen to. She had been driving west. That was the plan, if you could call it a plan. Drive west toward her sister's place in Kelowna and figure out the rest when she got there. But the rest had arrived early, the way it always does when you're least ready for it. The engine had just quit. No sputtering, no warning light, no drama. One moment it was running, and the next it wasn't, and Miriam had sat there in the sudden silence listening to the wind throw itself against the car windows and thought, very clearly, this is not good. She had been walking for what felt like 40 minutes when she saw it. It wasn't much to look at, a low shape pressed into the base of a long slope, half buried under a decade's worth of spruce branches and heavy snow. The roof had partially collapsed on one side. The single window facing the road was dark and filmed with grime. If it hadn't been for the faintest outline of a door frame catching the light from her phone's torch, she might have walked right past it. She stood at the edge of the road and looked at it. The temperature had dropped to somewhere around -22. Her gloves were in the car. She'd grabbed the garbage bag but forgotten the gloves, and her fingers had gone from burning to numb in the first 10 minutes. She could feel the cold working its way through her coat now, through the wool sweater beneath it settling in against her ribs. She looked at the door, then she walked toward it. Miriam had grown up in Lethbridge, the youngest of 4 children, and by some distance the quietest. Her mother had called her the one who watches. Her father had called her stubborn, but he'd meant it kindly. She had a way of holding on to things, including jobs and marriages and ideas about how life was supposed to go, long past the point where most people would have let them go. The marriage had lasted 26 years. She and Douglas had raised 2 kids in a split level in Red Deer, and for most of those years things had been, if not exactly good, then at least familiar. Douglas worked in oil and gas, which meant money when it was good and nothing when it wasn't, and Miriam had spent 2 decades smoothing over the distance between those 2 states. When Douglas left, he didn't leave for someone else, or if he did, Miriam never found out about it. He left because, as he put it one evening at the kitchen table while she was making pasta, he felt like he'd been sleepwalking for 20 years, and he wanted to wake up while there was still time. Miriam had stood at the stove and stirred the sauce and said nothing, because she didn't know what you say to that. A month later he was gone, and 6 months after that the lawyers had finished with what was left of their savings. She'd kept the house for another 2 years. Then the variable rate mortgage reset, and the payments jumped, and she missed one and then another. And by the spring she was behind in a way that didn't have a clean solution. She sold what she could, stored what she couldn't, and moved into a basement suite that smelled like carpet cleaner and someone else's cooking. Her daughter, Paige, lived in Vancouver with a man named Brett, who Miriam had met exactly twice and trusted exactly 0 times, and who had a talent for making Miriam feel, without ever saying anything directly unkind, that she was somehow the source of every problem her daughter had ever had. Her son, Adam, was in Fort McMurray and called on birthdays when he remembered, which was roughly half of them. She had been working at a garden centre in Red Deer for the past 1.5 years, which she liked well enough, and which paid just enough to cover rent and groceries, and not much else. Then the owner had sold the business in September, and the new owners had their own staff, and by October Miriam was out. She had applied for 31 jobs. She had heard back from 4. None of them had led anywhere. By the first week of November, she had $600 left in her account. A sister in Kelowna who had said the spare room was hers if she needed it. And nothing holding her to Red Deer anymore. She had loaded the car on a Wednesday morning, driven until the car decided it was done, and now she was here, pushing open a door that hadn't been touched in God knows how long, stumbling into the dark and trying very hard not to think about the fact that no one in the world knew exactly where she was. The door opened with a sound like a groan of protest. Wood swollen with years of moisture, the hinges red with rust, but it opened. Miriam stepped inside and pulled it shut behind her. The smell hit her first. Old wood, cold ash, something underneath that might have been dried herbs or mice or both. It was dark except for the weak beam of her phone, which she swept around the space slowly, taking stock. It was one room. Small, maybe 4 meters by 5. The walls were pine board, grey with age. On the left side, a wood stove sat on a flagstone base, its pipe disappearing into the ceiling. Beside it, a rusted metal bin that still held a few pieces of split birch. Against the back wall, a cot frame with no mattress, and above it, 3 wooden shelves holding a collection of tin cans, a mason jar of what appeared to be matches, and a folded wool blanket so old it had turned the color of weak tea. There was a small table in the center of the room with 2 chairs. On the table sat an oil lamp crusted with old wax but otherwise intact. Miriam stood very still and listened. Nothing. Only the wind outside and her own breathing. She found the matches. She lit the oil lamp and it caught, throwing a low amber circle of light across the floor. Then she opened the wood stove, arranged the birch pieces the way her father had taught her when she was 7 years old, and lit a fire. It took 4 matches and some suasion, but it caught. She sat down on the floor in front of the stove and held her hands toward the heat and waited for her fingers to come back to life. That was when she noticed the box. It was tucked into the far corner, under the cot frame, almost completely hidden by shadow. She wouldn't have seen it at all if she hadn't been sitting at exactly that angle with the lamp throwing light just so. It was a wooden box, cedar, she thought, roughly the size of a shoebox but twice as deep, with a small brass clasp that was not locked. She left it alone for a while. She was not the kind of person who went through other people's things. Even now, even here, with the wind trying to claw its way in under the door and her whole situation reduced to whatever fit in a garbage bag, she felt the instinct. This is not yours, Miriam. But eventually the cold retreated enough for her brain to start working properly again, and she thought, whoever left that box here, left it a very long time ago. The dust on the lid was undisturbed. The cabin itself had not been touched in years, maybe longer. She was not going through someone's things. She was trying to understand where she was. She pulled the box out from under the cot and set it on the table. Inside, underneath a piece of oilcloth, she found 3 things. The first was a photograph, black and white, slightly water-stained at one corner. A man and a woman standing in front of what appeared to be a storefront. The man was maybe 50, square-jawed, with the kind of serious expression that people wore in old photographs because they were told to hold still for a long time. The woman was younger, laughing at something just off camera. On the back, in pencil, H&A Millbrook Store, June 1961. The second was a letter handwritten in neat block printing on paper that had gone soft with age. Miriam unfolded it carefully, smoothing it flat. If you're reading this, it began, then something went wrong that I wasn't able to fix myself. I want you to know that this land is not abandoned. It belongs to this family. The deed is registered under the name Harold Beaumont, and there is a second deed, the one they don't want found, in the county records office in Sundre. Ask for the 1962 parcel registrations under Lot 7, Plan 4821. They tried to bury it. They didn't bury it far enough. Don't let them tell you it doesn't exist. I know it exists because I filed it myself. A.B. The third thing in the box was a key. Miriam read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it back along its original creases, set it on the table, and sat looking at the oil lamp for a long moment. Harold Beaumont. She turned the name over in her mind. A.B. Someone who knew about a piece of land, a deed, a story that had apparently gone unresolved long enough to be left in a cedar box in an abandoned cabin in the middle of the Alberta foothills. She was a woman who had lost her house, her savings, her job, and her sense of what came next. She was sitting in a stranger's cabin because her car had died in a snowstorm on her 53rd birthday. She had $41 and a garbage bag. None of which, she reminded herself, had anything to do with Harold Beaumont or his missing deed. She slept on the floor by the stove that night, wrapped in the old wool blanket, and in the morning the storm had quieted enough that she could walk the 2 kilometers to a gas station she'd passed before the car quit. She used $10 to buy a coffee and a gas station sandwich, and to charge her phone enough to call a tow. While she waited, she searched the name Harold Beaumont on her phone. The results were sparse but not empty. There was a brief obituary from a Sunday newspaper, dated 1979. Harold James Beaumont, aged 67, longtime resident of the Mountain View County area, survived by his daughter, Annette Louise Beaumont. No mention of a wife, no mention of property. She searched Annette Beaumont. Nothing. She sat with the coffee going cold in her hands and looked out at the parking lot, and the highway beyond it and the long grey sky. She thought about the letter. They tried to bury it. She thought about the key. The tow truck driver's name was Gary Pfeiffer, 60-ish, with a grey moustache and an easy manner. And while they waited for the car to be winched up, Miriam asked him, mostly to make conversation, if he knew anything about the old cabin back up the road. Gary squinted at the distance. Beaumont Place? She looked at him. You know it? Know of it. Everybody around here knows of it. He scratched the back of his neck. Harold Beaumont had that land, 40-50 acres running up the slope there. His daughter sold it off, I want to say, mid-80s, after the old man died. Sold it to the Keswick family. He paused. Or that's what the Keswicks always said. What does that mean? Gary looked at her with mild curiosity. You related to the Beaumonts? No, I just slept in the cabin last night. My car quit. He nodded, as if this was a reasonable explanation. Story I heard. Heard it from my father, so take it how you like. Harold Beaumont never agreed to sell. He had a daughter he'd lost touch with, and some kind of falling out with the county over the parcel lines. When he died, people just kind of moved on. The Keswicks started using the land, then claiming it, then eventually nobody questioned them. He shrugged. Small town, long time ago. What happened to the daughter? Annette? He shook his head. Don't know. She left the area. Never came back, far as I know. The car needed a fuel pump. The mechanic in Cochrane quoted her $820, which she didn't have. She sat in the waiting room for 20 minutes, staring at a stack of outdated magazines, working through the math and coming up short every way she tried. Then she called her sister. Barb picked up on the second ring. Barb had always been the practical one, the sister who knew what things cost and who to call and how to get things done. When Miriam explained the situation, there was a pause, and then Barb said, Can you drive anything else right now? Not without a car? What about a rental? Barb, I have $31. Another pause. Longer this time. Okay, Barb said. I'm going to send you some money. You get the car fixed and you get yourself to Kelowna. We'll figure the rest out when you're here. You can and you will. And Miriam? Her voice was steady. Happy birthday. I'm sorry I didn't call yesterday. Miriam pressed her thumb and forefinger to her eyes for a moment. It's okay, it's not, but we'll fix that too. Get moving. She didn't go to Kelowna. Not that day, anyway. She sat in the mechanic's waiting room while the car was being fixed, and she thought about what Gary had told her, and about the letter, and about the key, and about the fact that she had nothing to lose except time and her last shreds of dignity. She drove to Sundre the next morning. It took her an hour and 20 minutes on roads that hadn't been fully plowed, and she spent the drive telling herself she was being ridiculous, and then telling herself to be quiet. The county records office was a small room at the back of a municipal building that smelled like carpet and old paper. The woman at the desk introduced herself as Bev Hartley, 50-ish, efficient, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and when Miriam asked about 1962 parcels registrations under Lot 7, Plan 4821, Bev looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has heard a strange request and decided not to comment on it. That would be microfilm, Bev said. Give me a few minutes. It took closer to 20, but Bev came back carrying a folder and a printout. Here's the thing. Bev said, setting the folder on the counter and opening it. There are 2 registrations for that lot in 1962, which is unusual. Normally you'd see one, or an amendment to one. She pointed to the first sheet. This one's what's in the main registry index. Registered November 1962, shows the land as Crown land reverting to county jurisdiction. She pointed to the second sheet. This one's what came up when I went to the original filings. Same lot, same year, but registered in August. Prior to the other one, shows a private deed in the name of Harold Beaumont, with a right of survivorship clause designating his daughter. She looked up. The August registration was never entered into the main index, which means for the past 60-some years, it's essentially been invisible. Miriam looked at the paper. Is it valid? Bev chose her words carefully. I'm not a lawyer, but it's properly filed, it has a registration number, and it predates the other one by 3 months. She paused. I think you need a lawyer. She called Barb from the parking lot. Barb, to her credit, did not say anything unhelpful. She asked 4 questions. Is this documented? Do you have copies? Do you know where Annette Beaumont is? Do you have any of this in writing? And when Miriam said yes to the first 2 and no to the last 2, Barb said, My neighbor's son is a real estate lawyer. He's done some estate work. Let me call him. His name was Daniel Forsyth, and he called Miriam back within the hour. He had a careful voice and asked precise questions, and at the end of 15 minutes he said, What you're describing, if it holds up, is a claim of adverse registration. Essentially, a deed that was improperly excluded from the public index. It's not impossible to pursue, but you'd need to locate the surviving heir, the daughter. Annette Beaumont. If she's still alive, yes, she would be the one withstanding to make the claim. What if I find her? A brief silence. Then you'd want to connect her with a lawyer who handles estate and land claims. The land itself, 40 acres in Mountain View County, with current valuations, could be worth somewhere in the range of $800,000 to over $1 million, depending on what's on it and how it's zoned. Miriam sat in her car in the parking lot in Sundre, with the heater running and the fields white and flat in every direction. $800,000. In a cedar box under a cot in an abandoned cabin that she'd stumbled into because her car had quit in a snowstorm. She thought, Harold Beaumont left that letter for someone to find. She thought maybe it was meant to be found by someone who had nothing to lose. Finding Annette Beaumont took 11 days and most of Barb's long-distance patience. Annette Louise Beaumont, born 1945, had left Mountain View County in 1981 after a conflict with the county over her father's estate that had gone nowhere. She had married a man named George Sherritt in 1983, had the name Sherritt for 30 years, and then reverted to Beaumont after George died in 2014. She was living, Miriam eventually discovered through a combination of online searches and a very helpful librarian in Olds named Carol Price, in a senior's residence in Medicine Hat. She was 79 years old. Miriam drove to Medicine Hat. She had called ahead, explained herself to the residence's administrator in terms that she imagined sounded only slightly unhinged, and been told that Miss Beaumont would see her on a Thursday afternoon. Annette was a small woman, thin-boned, with white hair cut close to her head and eyes that were sharp in a way that made Miriam think of her own mother. She was sitting in a chair by the window when Miriam came in, and she looked at Miriam for a long moment before she said anything. You found the cabin, she said, not a question. My car broke down in the storm, Miriam said. I needed somewhere to get out of the cold. Annette nodded slowly. I left that box there in 1981, the year I gave up. She paused. I didn't really give up, I just ran out of road. She looked out the window. My father filed that deed himself. He didn't trust the county registrar, a man named Alton Keswick, who happened to be the father of the same family that ended up with the land. She said the name without heat, the way you say things you've been saying for 40 years. Dad thought if he filed it directly, it couldn't be touched. He didn't know Alton would just leave it out of the index and act like it never happened. Did you ever try to pursue it legally? 3 times. The lawyers I could afford kept running into dead ends. Missing records, unhelpful clerks, general stonewalling. She smiled thinly. I was 26 years old and I had no money, and the Keswicks had been in that county for 3 generations. I didn't win. The record is still there, Miriam said. The original filing. I have a copy. Annette looked at her. Miriam set the copy on the side table, along with Daniel Forsyth's card. The older woman picked up the paper and read it slowly, the way you read something you've been waiting a very long time to see. Her hands, Miriam noticed, were perfectly steady. "Why are you doing this?" Annette asked, not suspiciously, genuinely. Miriam thought about it. She thought about the night in the cabin, and her car, and the $41, and the birthday with no cake. She thought about Harold Beaumont's letter. Don't let them tell you it doesn't exist. Because someone left a letter asking for help, she said, and I happened to be the one who found it. Daniel Forsyth was, as Barb had said, good at his job. The process was not fast. Nothing involving land claims and 60-year-old records is fast. There were filings and counterfilings, and the Keswick family, now in its 3rd generation of ownership, represented by a lawyer from Calgary named Preston, who wore expensive shoes and had a way of looking at Miriam like she was an inconvenience he hadn't budgeted for, mounted a vigorous objection based on decades of adverse possession. The hearing was held in February in a courtroom in Red Deer of all places, and Miriam sat beside Annette and Daniel and watched Preston lay out the Keswick family's argument with the smooth confidence of a man who has always won. He was not expecting Daniel to produce the original microfilm registration, the registration number, and a sworn statement from Bev Hartley at the county records office, confirming that the August 1962 filing predated the November one by 93 days. He was also not expecting the second thing Daniel produced, a letter found by Miriam in the cedar box and sent by Daniel to a document examiner, confirming that the handwriting and paper were consistent with the early 1960s, and that the letter made specific reference to the registration number that appeared on the original filing. The judge, a woman named Honorable Justice Claudette Farrow, who had the expression of someone who had seen a great many things and was not easily surprised, took the matter under reserve and issued her ruling 3 weeks later. The Beaumont deed was valid. The 1962 registration, having been improperly excluded from the main index, had never been legally superseded. The land belonged to Annette Louise Beaumont. Miriam was in Kelowna when Daniel called with the news, staying in Barb's spare room, having finally made it there in December, and spent the winter doing something she hadn't done in years, resting. Just actually resting. Sleeping past 7, drinking coffee in Barb's warm kitchen, letting her shoulders come down from around her ears. She cried a little when Daniel told her. She wasn't sure exactly why. Relief, maybe. The particular feeling of having been part of something that mattered, even though she hadn't planned it and hadn't known what she was doing for most of it. Annette called her that same evening. "I want you to know," Annette said, "that I'm not going to keep all of it." Miriam didn't understand for a moment. The land will be sold. The Keswicks want to buy it. They're paying fair value now, interestingly enough, now that they have no choice. Annette's voice was dry. After taxes and fees and Daniel's very reasonable bill, there will be a significant amount left. I'm keeping enough to live comfortably for whatever years I have left. A pause. The rest I'm putting in trust. My father spent his whole life worrying about people who had no place to land. He used to say that a person can survive almost anything if they have one safe place to stand. I'd like to do something with that idea. What kind of something? A fund, Annette said, for women in housing crisis, specifically for women over 50, since apparently that's a gap nobody has adequately filled. Another dry pause. I'm calling it the Harold Beaumont Fund, and I'd like you to be on the board of trustees if you're willing. Miriam stood in Barb's kitchen, holding the phone, looking out at the Okanagan dark. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." That spring, Miriam drove back to the cabin. She wasn't sure why she needed to exactly. It wasn't on the way to anywhere, but she drove back through Cochrane and up the same highway and parked on the gravel shoulder and walked down the slope to the door. It was April, and the snow was mostly gone, and without the white covering the cabin looked different, smaller, more tired, more clearly something that had been given up on long ago. The spruce branches were still draped across the roof. The window was still filmed with grime. She stood in front of the door. She thought about the night she'd stood here in the dark, with numb fingers and $41 and her whole life in a garbage bag, and how she had looked at this door and not known what was on the other side. She thought about what Annette's father had written. Don't let them tell you it doesn't exist. She thought that maybe that was the thing about being at the very end of your options. You stopped making calculations about what was sensible, and you just did the thing that needed doing. You opened the door. She opened the door one more time and looked inside. The cedar box was still on the table where she'd left it. The oil lamp was there. The wood stove was cold. The old wool blanket was folded neatly on the cot frame. She stood there for a while, not doing anything, just being there. Then she walked back to the car. The Harold Beaumont Fund launched quietly in September of that year, with a small event in Medicine Hat that Annette attended in a wheelchair. She'd had a fall in June, nothing serious, but the chair was easier now. Barb came. Daniel came. Bev Hartley from the county records office came, which surprised Miriam and pleased her enormously. There were 12 women in the first intake of the program. Women who had lost houses, left bad situations, been priced out of cities they'd lived in for 20 years. Women who needed, as Harold Beaumont had put it, one safe place to stand. Miriam ran the intake interviews. She sat across the table from each of them and listened, and she thought about a parking lot in Cochrane, and a gas station sandwich and her phone at 3% battery. And she thought about how you never know what's on the other side of a door until you open it. She told them, "You found the right place. Let's figure out what comes next." So, I'll ask you the same thing I asked you at the beginning. What would you do? If you were standing in a storm with nothing left, and the only way through was a door you weren't sure you deserved to open. Miriam opened it, and she found something she wasn't looking for someone who had been waiting 60 years to be found. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you're new here, welcome to Claim the Drama. We tell the stories that remind us what people are actually capable of. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.